Well, good afternoon. I'm so glad that you are here with me today. Welcome to today's financial check-in with FAME. Somehow it's already 2024, and our topic for today is Better FAFSA, What You Need to Know. I'm Mila Tappan, the Manager of College Access and Outreach at FAME, and today we are going to be focusing on the new Better FAFSA that has just been rolled out. So this session is being recorded. We will share the recording as well as the slide deck next week with everyone who registered. So you'll be able to review any information that you want to, and we always welcome having you share any of our information with anyone that you think it might be valuable to. So with that, let's get started, and do feel free to put your questions in the chat. All right, so FAFSA simplification, which is what this whole project of revamping the FAFSA has been called, does represent the most significant overhaul of the FAFSA in 40 years. So this has been major. The whole FAFSA process is changing, the form itself has changed, and the formula that lives behind the scenes have also been updated. The 24-25 FAFSA was rolled out this past Saturday as part of a soft launch. The rollout was a little bit bumpy. Saturday was not a great day for the FAFSA. Sunday wasn't either, but slowly but surely it is getting better. So I feel comfortable that lots of people have been able to get the FAFSA done in the last day or two, and that it will be much better, continue to get even better as we go forward. And I apologize that I've had a bit of a cold. All right, so here is the update from federal student aid that we received back in this November, excuse me. And what we received was that information that the schools would not be receiving any FAFSA records until the end of January. And that was a surprise to everybody. So basically what that means is that FAFSAs are being submitted. They're not being processed though. They're being held, and they will be processed later this month. And once they're processed later this month, that is when that information is going to be sent to the schools listed on the student's FAFSA. So given that, I don't want people to feel pressure to get it done, like today, okay? The FAFSA is available increasingly, but it still is having periods when it's not available. And there are still some issues that we're seeing. So what we've been saying all along is to wait a week or 10 days after the release before you go ahead and file the FAFSA. Don't feel that pressure to get it done immediately. If there are corrections or updates that need to be made to the FAFSA, students won't be able to do those until the end of January, but it is possible to make corrections, so don't let that panic you. And schools won't be able to make corrections or do anything until at the end of January either, because of course, if they don't have records, they can't send out any requests for information or answer any questions about the FAFSA, nor can they certainly get out financial aid offers. So everything is just going to be a little bit more delayed this year. Now, when students do file their FAFSA, they're going to be notified of their student aid index. And what I want you to know is I'm kind of giving you like the timeline, and then we're going to go ahead and dive into how the FAFSA works. But I just kind of want to set it up so that you know that there's not a lot of pressure to get it done immediately, that you have time to get this done, and then what to expect once the FAFSA has been filed. So students will get a notification of their student aid index. That's called the SAI. That has replaced what was the EFC, or the expected family contribution. So they will see that when they hit submit, it'll be on their confirmation screen, as will be their Pell Grant eligibility if they are eligible for a Pell Grant. However, their FAFSA submission summary, which used to be called the student aid report, that's now being called the FAFSA submission summary, won't be available until early February is what they're saying, okay? So it's going to be this period of people going ahead, getting the FAFSA filed, and then waiting for the schools to get the information, waiting for students to be able to make any updates or corrections that they need to make, and waiting to be able to see their FAFSA submission summary. The FAFSA submission summary is something that some scholarship organizations, like the Worthington, like the Mitchell Scholarship, they want to see a copy of that. And of course, that won't be available, as we've just mentioned, until February. Worthington, I know, has said that they will accept a copy of the submission confirmation email as well in the meantime. So if you are a student or you have a student who's applying for the Worthington or another scholarship like the Mitchell, and they need a copy of their FAFSA submission summary, check with them to see if in the meantime they will accept the confirmation email instead. Okay, so that's kind of what we're expecting, that there's the FAFSA is available. It's available most of the time. It is down for periods of time still, but those hours are increasing. We will eventually get to the point that it's available pretty much 24/7. But don't feel the pressure to do it immediately. Getting it done in the month of January is sufficient. And that's what we're really encouraging people to do, is to think about that particular timeline. So now what I'd like to move into is what you need to do to get ready to file the FAFSA, if you haven't already, and what you will expect when you go to file the FAFSA. So the first step in filing the FAFSA is to set up a federal student aid account. That is the first step in the FAFSA filing process. So when someone goes to set up their federal student aid account, they create a username and password. And we refer to that username and password as your FSA ID. So if I say to someone, do you have your FSA ID? What I mean is, have you gone in, have you created your federal student aid account and created your FSA, excuse me, your username and password? Do you have those available to use now? So the FSA ID is required to access the FAFSA, and it is required to access all segments of the studentaid.gov website, and it also serves as an individual's legal signature. Now, one of the things that they've done to make this process all more secure is that every time an individual uses their FSA ID, they are going to be required to go through two-step verification. So I think we're getting really used to this in all sorts of aspects of our lives. So every time you, your student, anybody uses an FSA ID, signs in with that username and password, what they're going to experience is they're going to have to send a text or have a text sent or receive an email with a code. They'll have to put that code in order to proceed. So what that just means is that whenever you're going to be doing anything where you're using your FSA ID, you need to be sure that you're somewhere where you have access to receive a text and or an email, depending on what you have set up. That seems obvious, but I will say sometimes we're doing events in high schools that are so solidly built that we can't get a text. So those are just some things to keep in mind when you're proceeding through this process. Now, when you are creating your student aid account, setting up your FSA ID, you will be providing identifying information, which will include your social security number. So individuals in the past have always needed to have a social security number in order to create a federal student aid account, because the social security number is how people's identities were confirmed so that we knew it was okay. So federal student aid knew it was okay for people to go in and go through this process. They have created a process now for individuals who don't have a social security number to create one. So all students have to have a social security number to be eligible for federal aid, but parents don't necessarily. So we have a situation where we have, let's say, people who are newer to the state of Maine from out of the country, and the parents might not have a social security number. There is now a way for them to create a federal student aid account. I'm not going to go into that today, but if people have questions about that, just reach out to me and I will share additional information on that. We have done a webinar on that particular topic. So accounts are created at studentaid.gov. So that is where you would go to create your federal student aid account. Individuals have to have a unique email address. So like a family cannot share an email address for this purpose. For every FSA ID, you have to have a unique individual with a unique email address, with unique demographic information, and a unique cell phone number if you choose to share that as well. Okay, so all of that information must be unique. Now, we do recommend that students not use their high school email address when they're creating their FSA IDs. The reason is that what's going to happen when they graduate from high school is that they will no longer have access to their high school email account. They are going to need to have access to that account for years and years to come, their FSA ID account for years and years to come. So we want to be sure that they have a reliable email address attached to that. So we recommend that they create a Gmail account or a Hotmail account or something like that. If students have already created an FSA ID and they use their high school email address, it's easy enough to go in back into studentaid.gov, click on settings, and they can update their email address. You can do that anytime with any of your information. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to talk a little bit about this concept of contributors and who needs FSA IDs. I do have some questions, and I'm going to check those in just a moment. I'll pause and take questions once I finish this section. So who needs an FSA ID? Everyone who is a contributor to the FAFSA needs to have their own FSA ID. So a contributor is going to be someone that has to provide information on the FAFSA and is required to provide consent and approval. So they provide consent and they click approval to allow their information to be shared with the IRS, for the IRS to retrieve their tax information, transfer it into the FAFSA, and then use that information to determine financial aid eligibility and share that information with the colleges and other organizations like FAME, to be honest, because we administer the main state grant. Okay, so everyone who has to provide consent is going to need to have their own FSA ID. So who are those people that are going to have to provide consent, being referred to again as contributors? So the student is always a contributor. So every single student out there needs to have their own FSA ID, again, that is tied to their social security number. Other possible contributors include parents, the parent's spouse, and the student spouse. So those are possible contributors. So what I'd like to do next is to go through how we identify exactly on the parent side who those contributors are. Okay, so if a student is a dependent student, and most students under the age of 24 are, then parent information is typically required on the FAFSA. So if parent information is required, which parents are considered contributors? So if parents are married to each other and they filed a joint tax return in 2022, so that's the key year, that's the base year of this year's FAFSA, they filed a joint tax return, information for both parents is required. So both parents have to provide their demographic information, and income for both parents is going to be taken into consideration. But only one parent needs to get an FSA ID, okay? So even though they're married, only one parent has to get an FSA ID, because if you're a married couple who files a joint tax return, you can provide consent and approval on behalf of the other. So my husband and I are married. We filed a joint tax return in 2022. I am the only one that has to have, if I choose to be the one, that has to have an FSA ID, because I can go in and complete a FAFSA for our kiddos, and I can provide consent and approval on behalf of my husband. I'm still going to list his demographic information, still going to be calculated the eligibility based on our joint income, but only one parent needs an FSA ID. If parents are married, but they filed separate tax returns in 2022, or if parents live together, the biological parents live together, but they aren't married, so they can't file a joint tax return, then information for both parents, of course, is required, and both parents will need their own FSA ID, and that's different than it's been in the past. So if you are a married couple, for example, and in 2022 you filed separate tax returns, then both parents are going to need their own FSA ID. Now let's talk for a moment about situations where parents are divorced, separated, or were never married and don't live in the same household. This is a two-step process. First, we have to determine which parent has to be on the FAFSA. So in a case where, let's just say, parents are divorced, then what we need to determine is which of those parents needs to complete the FAFSA on behalf of the student, because it's not going to be both. So when parents are divorced, it's the parent that provided the most financial support over the last 12 months. That is the parent who needs to complete the FAFSA for that student. Believe it or not, the other parent does not need to provide any information and is not required to do anything with the FAFSA. So let's just say that I am the student, my parents are divorced, my mom provides 60% of my support, my dad 40%. I still have a relationship with him, he provides some support. But because mom provides the most financial support, mom is going to be the parent on the FAFSA, and she will need to get her own FSA ID. Okay? Biological dad, nothing, doesn't need to be involved in this process at all. But I do have one more step in this process. If mom is remarried, as of the day the FAFSA is filed, not in 2022, but on the day the FAFSA is filed, then mom's spouse would also be required to have their information on the FAFSA. That's not new, it's been that way, but I know it's something that causes frustration and concern sometimes. Whether or not the spouse needs their own FSA ID depends on whether a joint tax return was filed in 2022. So let's just say, for example, this couple have been married for years. They filed a joint tax return in 2022. Only mom needs an FSA ID. But let's just say parents got married over the summer. So in 2022, they did not file a joint tax return. Information for both parents is required, and both parents are going to need to have their own FSA ID. So I know that doesn't always make people happy, but those are the requirements for the federal regulations. So contributors without an FSA ID. So we spent the fall really encouraging people to create these accounts. We've been doing lots of sessions, but if people haven't created one, we need them to do that now. The FSA ID needs to be created several days before filing the FAFSA. And that is to allow time for that FSA ID to be authenticated, basically for the information to be matched with the Social Security Administration. The reason that we want people to do this ahead of time is if the FSA ID has not been authenticated, people are going to have to manually enter all of their tax information. And that's just going to make filing the FAFSA a little bit harder. So the best case scenario is for people to get those FSA IDs ahead of time, at least several days. 3 is what they say is usually 2 to 3 days. Let's go with 3 in this case. Get those FSA IDs, get them, make sure that they've been authenticated, and then do the FAFSA so that tax information can come over directly from the IRS. It's going to make things so much easier. Now, one last question before I take a quick break. That is going to be that if you already have an FSA ID, then you don't get a new one. So an individual can only have one because, again, it's tied to your Social Security number. So if as a parent, you already have an FSA ID, maybe you have one because you went to school. It would be since 2015 that FSA IDs have existed. Or maybe you have federal student loans that you're still repaying, and so you have an FSA ID so you can access information about them. Or maybe you have an older child that's already been through this process and you created an FSA ID. If you already have one, you're going to use that same one, that same username and password in order to access the FAFSA for this student. If you can't remember your username and password, go to studentaid.gov, click on login, and there you can retrieve your username and password or retrieve your username and reset your password. Okay, Mary, do we have any questions?
We did, but you've really answered all of them. There were questions about who needs the FSA ID, and then a question about what if I can't remember it? Should I create a new one? And so I've addressed that, and you've also addressed it.
Okay.
The only last question, I know you mentioned at the beginning, obviously, this presentation, the slides and a recording of this will be made available after the fact. But there was a question about whether or not there's a presentation that FAME has available that others could use to present to students and families. This might perhaps be the appropriate slide deck for that, but is there anything else that you might suggest if we, to share for other professionals who might want to share it with various audiences?
Yeah, this one really is focused on students and families. So this one I think could be one of them. I will say that next Wednesday we have our monthly Wednesday webinar, and guess what the topic is? It's going to be on the FAFSA. That's actually an extended session that will be an hour and a half, where we'll actually walk through the FAFSA and look at a lot of screenshots. We're going to do a little bit of that in a moment here. But that one will be much more comprehensive. So I would say all of our presentations that are related to all of our presentations are available, but we have a page that I'm going to share again, the FAFSA simplification page on our website, where prior presentations are all there, the recordings, the slide deck. This one will be available on our website, as well as the one on Wednesday. So people can always feel free to use any of our presentations, pick and choose, depending on the amount of time they have. Or they can reach out to me if they're looking for something in particular. Okay.
Great. And then 2 more questions just popped up. These are quick ones. How many days in advance should students' parents create their FSA ID? I think you addressed that, but
2 to 3 is what they say. So I will say we
Yeah,
had been saying a week, but now that people really need to, be thinking about getting the FAFSA done, 2 to 3 days is what FSA, Federal Student Aid, says. Yeah, I'd err on the side of 3 just to be sure.
okay. And then the last one, what if an individual no longer has access to the email that they used when they created the FSA ID?
Well, it depends on when they created their FSA ID. They might have set up access via text or the ability to retrieve a username via text and reset a password via text. And if they can do that, then they can get in and they can change their email address. If it's a situation, and there was a period of time where there was no ability to add the email address, try the challenge questions. And if they can't answer the challenge questions and reset and get back in that way, then they will need to call federal student aid. Okay.
Right.
So that's why we want people to set it up with an email address they're going to have for a longer period of time. And that's why we want people to set up include their cell phone number so that the text option is available. They can also set up an authenticator app as well. So we really want people to set up as many of those options as possible because things do change over time. Our email addresses, our phone numbers. So having more options is better.
Great. Thank you, Mila. I think we're all set to continue.
Okay, all right. So let's move on. So just want you to see a screenshot of federal student aid so you can see where you would log in. So if you do need to create one, you will just log in and click on we'll go to create account. If you already have information and you want to log in and just check things, or you can't remember your information, but you have an account, click on login, and you can walk through the steps to retrieve and reset information. If you're doing it on a phone, I wouldn't do the FAFSA on the phone. But if you just want to check your FSA ID information or create one, you probably could do that on a phone. It's a little bit quicker and easier than doing the FAFSA. That probably is about a 5-minute process. So you would go and you would click on the little person here to do that. All right, now let's talk about actually filing the FAFSA. And so I'm assuming in my audience, I have people, it sounds like, who have done this process before, and then probably people who haven't. So I'm not focusing a lot on how it was and how it is, but there are some cases where I do want to point out those changes because I think they are significant to people who have done it previously. So new this year, the FAFSA is what we're referring to as a roles-based form. There is a student section on the FAFSA, and there is a parent section on the FAFSA. These are basically segmented sections. So it's not like it used to be where you just started and you went all the way through. You started with student questions and then you saw parent questions. There's a student section and a parent section now. When the student logs in with their FSA ID, they only see student questions. Students will never, when they log in with their FSA ID, students will never see parent questions. When the parent logs in with their FSA ID, they will see their parent questions. And in a few cases, they will be able to see student questions. And we'll talk a little bit more about that going forward. Okay. So whoever starts the FAFSA will invite the other party to complete the remaining portion of the FAFSA. So either individual, either the parent or the student can start the FAFSA. So when you go to studentaid.gov and you click on, I'm going to back up for a moment here because I think this is important. I want to show you. See where it says FAFSA form right here? You just click on that. So when you click on that, once you've logged in with your FSA ID, you're going to see this, and you're going to notice that it already knows who I am because I've logged in with my FSA ID, and I'm going to click whether I am the student or I am the parent. Now, I could be either. I could be a student myself applying for financial aid, even though I'm older, or I might be the parent. So I'm going to select whichever role I am in at the moment. So you go, finish that off in the way that's appropriate for you, or you select the option that's appropriate for you. Again, either the student or the parent can start the FAFSA. So what I want to do now is I want to run through the sequencing, the flow. If the student starts the FAFSA, and then I want to run through the sequencing when the parent starts the FAFSA, just so you can kind of determine which way you think will work best for you. Either option is fine, and I think it's really situationally dependent as to which works best for families. So if the student starts the FAFSA, now mind you, they've already logged in with their FSA ID to get in to do this. they are going to first see 4 onboarding screens. So basically, they've created these short videos that say what the FAFSA is, who contributors are, what to expect, and what happens after the FAFSA has been submitted. So if you're looking for additional information on any of those pieces of the process, those videos, those short videos will help you get some additional information. The next thing the student is going to do is they're just going to review their their identity information. So they've logged in already with their FSA ID. So much of their identifying information is going to be pre-filled, their name, their social. It's going to come over from their FSA ID. So they're going to review that information, make sure it's accurate. If they see something that is critical that is wrong, they will need to go back to their FSA ID account and fix it under settings. But in other cases, they'll be able to update other pieces that are less important. So students will review their information. Again, if they need to make an update, they go back to studentaid.gov and under settings, make those updates, or if the field is editable, they'll know they can update information there within the FAFSA. Hope that was clear. I didn't say that very well. So once they have reviewed their identifying information, hopefully it's all good to go, then they will answer a series of questions that will determine their dependency status. So they are now referring to these questions as their basically personal circumstance questions. So these are going to be questions like, are you married? Because if you're married, you are automatically independent. It's going to be questions like, are you a veteran in the military? Because you're automatically independent. Are you a grad student? Because you're automatically independent. Are you a student who has been in foster care since the age of 13? Are you a student who's in the legal guardianship of somebody else? Are you a student who is an emancipated minor? In circumstances like that, the student is automatically independent and won't need parent information. So they're gonna answer those questions. They're gonna answer an other circumstances question that asks them basically if they're homeless or considered to be homeless, and if they have any other unusual circumstances. So these questions are necessary because these questions will dictate whether parent information is needed. Okay. So if they can say yes to any of those special circumstances, they will not have to provide parent information. The vast majority of students under 24, though, will not be able to answer yes to any of those questions and will need to provide parent information. So it's going to come up and say, look, you seem to be a dependent student, so you will need to provide parent information on your FAFSA. Now, there's one thing I want to highlight because the FAFSA again is new, and so we're seeing things for the first time. But on the message boards that I'm on, this question is causing a little confusion, so I wanted to highlight it today. When a student is considered to be dependent and they get this message, they're going to see this here: apply for a direct unsubsidized loan only. I do not like the way this is because what this is basically saying is if the student is filling this out and if the parents are unwilling to provide their information, but the student doesn't have unusual circumstances, then they would say, yes, I do want to apply for an unsub loan. So this is confusing because what happens is if a dependent student has parents who will not do the FAFSA, but they don't have unusual circumstances, the student is not eligible for federal student aid except that they can get an unsubsidized loan. That's the only thing they can get. So that's what this is about. This is about for those students whose parents are not willing to fill out the FAFSA, but they don't have unusual circumstances, they would say yes to this so that they can get an unsub loan only, and then they wouldn't be providing parent information because the whole point is here their parents aren't willing to do so. You, I'm assuming because you're here and willing to learn about this, and we're going to fill out FAFSAs on behalf of your students, you want to answer this question no, okay? Because your student will be eligible for a loan. That will happen. But this is not your circumstance, okay? Your circumstance is that you are willing, okay? So where it says, are you unwilling? No, you are not unwilling. So you want to answer that question no. So I'm sorry that's so confusing. We are providing feedback on that, but I just want to point that out because I am seeing people who didn't see that question or didn't read it carefully and just thought, yes, I want that, and then submitted their FAFSA and realized they had messed up. And now they can't fix it because the FAFSA isn't going to be processed until January. Later this month in January, once they are processed, it can be fixed then, but that's 3 weeks or so of stress for that parent. So I'm highlighting that for that reason. All right. So, assuming the student says I'm dependent or they are figured out to be dependent and they believe their parents are willing to provide information, then the student is going to share information about their parents, which basically serves as an invitation to have their parents complete the parent section of the FAFSA. So, the student is going to provide parent information, and you can see what that is here. It's their name, their date of birth, and their social security number. Okay. So when we talk about the pros and cons of students starting the FAFSA versus parents starting the FAFSA, there may be situations where it's not going to work for the student to start the FAFSA because they don't know their parents' information and parents aren't willing to share it with them. I'd probably give my kids my social security number for this purpose, but I know parents, may not be willing to. And this information has to be provided and it has to be accurate for this process to work. Okay, so the student can't just guess at the social security number. If they do that, the process doesn't work because it's not going to link the parent section and the student section together behind the scenes. Okay, so if students are going to start the FAFSA, they need to have that information from their parents in order to proceed and have the FAFSA process work. But if students do have that information, they provide that information, then they will be able to continue. So the parents will be sent an email inviting them, but simultaneously, the student is able to continue. They'll provide their remaining demographic questions like their gender, ethnicity, citizenship, high school. They'll provide their student financial information. Now, if they are providing consent, we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment, then the information is going to come over directly from the IRS. So that's going to be really slick. It's working very well, and it's going to make filing the FAFSA very easy. They will also list all of the colleges that they want to receive their FAFSA data. Okay, so they'll provide demographic information, financial information, they'll list their colleges, and then they will review and click a box, which is basically providing their signature. Again, today I'm not going through all those screenshots, but we will on Wednesday during our Wednesday webinar, and that will be available on our website. So you can check that out later, even if you just want to view the screenshots in sequence. Now we'll stop for questions in a moment. So when the student fills out that section with the parent information, the parent will receive an email. It's basically instantaneous. Or the parent can just go to studentaid.gov. So we spent a lot of time talking in our organization about you don't click on links and emails. So people don't want to click on a link. They can just go directly to studentaid.gov. When they log into studentaid.gov, they will see this. They will see something that says that you've been requested to be a contributor, and you can just click on Get Started. Okay. This is kind of what the email looks like, just letting parents know that they have been requested to provide information and gives them a little bit of a background as to why they should do that. Okay, so parents will get that. Once the parent gets that invite or just goes directly to studentaid.gov and clicks on that link, and they can be doing this while their student is completing their section, they will log in and they will go to the parent section. And in the parent section, they'll see those same onboarding screens. They'll provide consent and approval. They'll provide their demographic information. They'll provide parent financials. And again, the information can come over directly from the IRS as long as they provide consent and approval. They'll review and they will sign. Once the student section is all complete, and once the parent section is all complete, whoever is the last party to complete it will then see an option to submit the FAFSA. They will click on that and the FAFSA will be submitted. Okay, so parents, the student can start if they have your information. You'll get the invite. You'll go to studentaid.gov. You'll log in with your FSA ID. You'll complete the parent section. Whoever finishes first can hit the submit button. So in the perfect world scenario, which is what I think they built this for, unrealistically, to be honest with you, is that, you've got the student and the parent sitting at the table. Again, perfect world, they have two devices. The student starts, they fill out their section, they provide parent information. Once they've done that, the parent goes to studentaid.gov, they log in, they start, they click on that, get started button, and they are simultaneously filling out their section. They both get it done. Whoever finishes last hits submit. That's the perfect world. I know that might not exist, but if you can make that happen, I think that's going to be the easiest way to get the FAFSA completed. Now, if the parent starts the FAFSA, here's how the sequencing will work. If the parent starts the FAFSA, the first thing they will do is provide the student's identifying information. So just like the student provided the parent in that first scenario, the parent will provide that student information. That will get an email sent, and that information will then allow the student to log into studentaid.gov and to connect into the student section of the FAFSA. The parents will see those onboarding screens. Now, the parents will see some of the student questions. And that's what I said a moment ago. There are some exceptions. So in this scenario, the parent would see those questions that are used to determine dependency status. So they're going to see those questions like, are you married? And this is about the student. So that they know whether parent information is required. Because some parents might go start the FAFSA and think they need to provide information, but then they realize, oh my goodness, my student's a grad student now. They're independent. I don't have to provide any information. Okay. So that's why the sequencing is that the parent, if they start it, first answers those handful of questions that determine dependency status so that they know whether or not parent information is required. Again, sticking with the situation where parent information is required because the student is dependent. This is the same screen I showed you a moment ago. Be careful of this question here. You're going to say no and you're going to continue. And then what you will do as a parent is you will review your own identity and make sure everything looks correct and fix it if not. You will provide consent and approval. You will provide your demographic information. Keep in mind that if you're married, you're going to provide demographic information for both parents. That's always been the case, even though only one of you, if you're married and file a joint tax return, has to log in and go through this process. You're going to provide financials. Again, most of that will come over from the IRS, so that should be very quick and easy. Spouse information, again, if applicable, and then you are going to review your information, you're going to sign it. The student will then receive the email invitation or get the go in directly to studentaid.gov. They will select the invitation, okay, and then, excuse me, sorry, lost my train of thought for a second. This is all new to me too, you guys. I feel pretty good about it, but it is definitely still a learning curve for us. So if the student gets the invitation, they can go ahead and they can finish it. Okay, so student could log in and accept the invitation, and then they will provide the remaining student questions. So the other demographic questions, the financial, list their schools. Now, if you are a parent who wants to complete as much of this process as possible, I might have been one of those, and there's pros and cons on both sides. There is a way for the parent to go back in after they finish their section. So keep in mind, at this point, the parent would have done the few student demographic of the few student dependency questions. The parent would have filled out their section and clicked the box to sign, seen this screen. But if I'm one of those people that I want to fill out the rest of the student questions, there's a little link down here at the bottom that's circled, okay? So if a parent wants to finish off most, not all, they can't do all, most of the remaining student questions, they can click on that link that they want to fill in that information manually. They will then be taken to the student section without any student FSA IDs being needed, and they can answer the other demographic questions. But there is a downside that they are going to have to enter all of the income information manually. Okay. So if a parent chooses to do this, the downside is that the IRS can't send tax information because the student has not provided consent. The student has not logged in themselves at this point. So if that doesn't happen, all the income information has to be provided manually. So that is a downside to doing it that way. So regardless of whether the student goes in and completes their section of the FAFSA, or the parent clicks on that little link and goes and answers all of the rest of the questions that they're going to see are going to be the same. Those demographic questions, again, those student financials, that if the parent does them will need to be entered manually. All of the colleges that they want, they can list up to 20, and they want to list every single school that's a possibility because they won't be able to add schools until later in January or early February, okay? If the parent chooses to do this, so if the parent says, I want to answer all these questions, the student still has to, once they've done that, the student still has to log in with their FSA ID though, okay? They've got to do that because they need to provide consent and sign the FAFSA. Only the student can do that on their behalf. The parent cannot do that on their behalf. They can fill out everything else, but they can't do that. So you've got three scenarios that you can decide what works best for you. Student start, and then parent finish, parent start, and student finish, and do the vast majority of their questions, or all of their student questions, or parent start, do most of the student questions, and then just the student come in and sign at the end. Now, I just want to talk about consent for a bit, and then I will take a quick break to see if we do have questions, Mary, for me to address. So the providing of consent and approval, on the right-hand side, you're going to see what parents see. And I've just shown you a snippet. This is a really, really long, it's a 3 screenshot page that's providing consent and approval and what that looks like. And they give you all the details. There's an FAQ at the bottom. But you can see that ultimately what you do is you have to approve to provide consent and approval. Surprisingly to us, when we logged in, so I did a FAFSA the other day as if I were the student, and when a student logs in, all they have to do to provide consent and approval, and it's the first thing, you can see that screen behind us, is the very first screen. All they have to do is accept, okay? So how you're providing consent and approval is looking different as we're seeing it. For the student, it's very simple. In both cases, it's just a check of a box, but what students see is much more limited than to what parents see. Okay, so I just wanted to show you that. So, if you were, because I think what we had happen was we thought in the drafts we saw, the student saw the same thing the parent did. And when one of our staff did the FAFSA for their student, they didn't think they provided consent and approval. They thought they missed it because it was right here at the beginning and much shorter than what had been in the draft forms. So just highlighting that, that these things are both consent and approval. They just look different. All right, Mary, before we go on to any other items that I think are important for people to know, given that we only have an hour, can't do everything I wish I could tell you today. What things have come up that we should address?
Absolutely. So real quickly, if the parent enters the student financial information manually, does that all but guarantee they will be selected for verification by their school?
That's a very, very, very good question. And that has been asked of federal student aid, and they said no. That simply doing that will not result in a student being selected for verification. It
Got
is
it. Thank
supposed to
you.
be totally random selection this year. And I think given the other issues, they're going to try to make verification as limited as possible. But yes, they've told us no.
Okay, thank you. The next
Oh, can I
question.
say one more thing?
Oh,
Actually,
sure. Yeah.
can I say one more thing? Because this is important, and this is actually why I think they won't necessarily be selected. Is what actually happens, just to get into the weeds a little bit. If the parent enters the information manually, the student then is going to go in and provide consent and approval. At that point in time that they've provided consent and approval, their FAFSA actually will go back out to IRS, or their information will go back to IRS, and it will be overlaid with income information if the IRS had income information for that student.
Gotcha.
So
Thank
it
you.
will actually update with the IRS stuff once consent and approval is provided. And let me just be clear too, that everybody has to provide consent and approval or the student isn't eligible for federal student aid. So even if a student is a non-tax filer, even if the parents are non-tax filers, you still have to provide consent and approval.
Got it. The next question was, am I to understand correctly that the easiest route to completion is to have the student start the FAFSA first and then the parent gets an invite?
Mhm. If you are in a situation, especially if you and the student are together in the same room, yes, I think that seems to be the pathway that's what they designed it to be, right? That's how they want it to be. So that is the pathway that works, I think, the best. That being said, I think very often parents are going to start this because they are going to want to provide the students information rather than vice versa.
Gotcha. And then this is just kind of a technical, the question came up earlier and I answered it in part. when you fill out the FAFSA, you have to provide your legal name as displayed essentially of what's on your social security card.
Right.
Remind me because I forget if someone has two last names or a hyphenated last name, there's kind of some trickiness there in terms of how to type that into the FAFSA.
Yeah. What what's supposed to be the case is that when people create their FSA ID, that they are to enter their last name exactly as it shows on their social security card. So however it shows on their social security card is how we want them to do that. They have expanded the field, so I can't remember exactly how many characters, but it is a much longer. So they should just go ahead, if they've got one and they're unsure of how it's listed on their social security card, pull it out if they can, type it in exactly as they can, and just put in as much of it as they can. If they need to leave off the last three letters, that's okay. That should work. And what you're going to do is you're going to get an email. You're supposed to, I'm not sure this is happening 100% of the time. You're supposed to get an email that your information was confirmed or authenticated by the Social Security Administration, after 2 to 3 days. What you can do if you're unsure is you can always log back into studentaid.gov. When you log back into studentaid.gov, it is going to show you, now I don't have a screenshot handy right at the moment, but it's going to show you that your information matched. So if you have any doubt about whether your information has been authenticated by the Social Security Administration, you can go back into studentaid.gov and click on login. And when you log in, you're going to see whether it's been matched. If it hasn't, then you're going to need to follow up if it's been more than a couple days.
That's
Okay.
all, Mila. Thank you.
All right. All right. Well, let's push on with just some highlights that I think are important things that I want you to know. Okay, so again, almost all information is going to come directly from the federal tax return. Again, for people who file taxes, not everybody does file taxes, and that's just fine. And people don't need to in some circumstances, and they can proceed through this process with no issue if that's their situation. But if people who do file taxes, then the information is going to come directly from the IRS. Now, if people have done this before, they might be saying, well, hasn't it been coming from the IRS? Yes, it has been, but it's been through what's been called the IRS data retrieval tool. So basically what we did, let's say I'm the parent, I would put in my information, I would request my information from the IRS, they would send it back, and then I would share it with federal student aid. That process did not work 100%. And I was a middleman on that one. Now what that's been replaced with is the direct data exchange. So as long as I provide consent and approval, my information is going to be automatically sent to the IRS, my tax information returned to federal student aid and used to calculate eligibility on the FAFSA. So that information is called federal tax information, FTI. So that's another term we're using this year. The federal tax information will be imported, into the federal tax information module, the FTI module. So tax information will not actually show on the FAFSA. So don't worry that you don't see it. The comments I'm seeing from many people who have done the FAFSA so far is that it's too easy. They think they've missed a step because it was so easy this year. And that's because of this direct data exchange. So for many of you, you will never see that information. And there's only a couple of income questions you'll have to answer. Now, there are situations in which people are going to have to provide tax information manually. For example, if someone was married and filed a joint tax return in 22 and is now divorced, the FAFSA doesn't know what to do with that income. So there are going to be a handful of situations where people have to enter it manually, but those are going to be limited. And even when they have to enter it manually, they need to provide consent and approval. As I said, everyone has to provide consent and approval, even non-tax filers. People have done the FAFSA before. You might recall that there was an untaxed income page where we had to do things like provide our contributions to our retirement plan. So we had to look on our W-2s and find that information. This page is gone. So there is no untaxed income page. So again, there's a whole bunch of questions that are no longer being asked at all. This is why it was called FAFSA simplification, because it is supposed to be much simpler. And there's a whole bunch of questions that are no longer there specifically in the income section. So no contributions to retirement, no workers' comp, no cash support or money paid on others' behalf. All of those questions are completely gone from the FAFSA. Now, one of the things that I wanted to also highlight is family size. So family size is coming over from the IRS. So what the IRS is doing is they're basically looking at a tax return and they're saying, okay, how many people are in that family? And there's two issues with this that I want to highlight. One is that it's not working correctly at the moment, apparently, and that secondly, that there are going to be cases where even when it is working correctly, it needs to be updated. Okay. So family size, again, based on 22 tax information. So this is, I filled out a FAFSA the other day. And my family size, I almost didn't check it because the way this bottom half here doesn't show up initially. It basically says, is the student's family size different from the number of individuals claimed on their 22 tax return? So I got to be honest, I almost passed right by this question and said no, because my family size hasn't changed. But I thought, you know what, I'm gonna double check it. So I clicked on yes, and it said that my family size was 2. And it told me it's because there's a student and there's a spouse. Well, that was incorrect in my situation because I still have a child that I claim. So it's easy enough, and I could update that information. Okay. So I want everybody, even if you think your information is the same as it was in 22, I want everyone to click yes on this question, at least for now, and make sure that the information that they're showing is correct. Okay. So if it is correct, great, you just move on. If it isn't, then you can add in additional people. Okay. And so it doesn't show this, I've jumped ahead by one screen, but it's going to let you add in that additional person. Okay. So be sure you check it. Click on the, has it changed? Even if it hasn't, click yes, so you can verify that it is correct. Okay. And I sometimes am kind of like, making a joke about some of these things. I know this is serious, and I know that all of you, are kind of maybe feeling a little bit of stress. I'm just trying to let you know that everyone is kind of feeling the stress from this, and that we're all going to get through this together, and that it's not a perfect tool. We knew it wasn't going to be, but it's getting better every day, and I just want people to feel a little bit more relaxed. So trying to add a little bit of humor into to all of this, and I hope that's an okay approach for you. So the number in college. So in the past, if people had multiple kids in college, the EFC, which has been replaced by the SAI, was divided by the number of kids in college. And that is no longer the case. There is a reason for that. If anyone is curious, you can email me back and I will share the longer detailed reason. It's actually a pretty good reason why that's the case. However, the question does remain on there. So on that last screen, you actually could see it. So you might be thinking, well, she said it isn't going to be divided by the number of people in college, but they're still asking it. Yes, you are correct. They are still going to ask it, and the schools will receive that information. The schools will not necessarily do anything with it automatically. I don't think most schools, they can't change federal eligibility because it's not part of the formula. They could look at their own money and do something different if they wanted to, but I think most schools are just going to hold tight if families feel like this is a financial hardship to no longer have that SAI divided into, and they're struggling to pay for their kids to go to college, and they're paying out of pocket for multiple kids to go to college, they can reach out to the school and request a special circumstance review. Basically, they can request an appeal. So please do that if that is your situation. And then another really big thing I want to share is the asset piece. So one of the changes to the new FAFSA is that many, many, many more people are going to be exempt from having to provide asset information. So that's a really good thing. Many, many people will not have to provide asset information. That includes any families who receive any federally means tested benefit in 2022. So families where any family member received a federally means tested benefit in 2022 or 23. I might have said that wrong a second ago. That includes free and reduced lunch. So any one of you who has a public school student in Maine, your student is receiving free and reduced lunch because every public school student is eligible for free and reduced lunch in Maine. So I want every one of you that has a student in public school to check yes to the free and reduced lunch box. Every single one. Because what that is going to mean is that you will not have to provide assets. That is correct. We verified that with federal student aid. That is appropriate. There are 7 states in the US for whom this is the case, and this is the way that you can complete the FAFSA, and you therefore will not have to provide any asset information on the FAFSA. Now, just a quick caveat. This question is in the parent section. If the student starts the FAFSA, so the parent hasn't done this section yet, the student will see those asset questions, but any amounts they put in will be excluded when the FAFSA is processed. Okay, so when you have any of these circumstances, you do not have to provide any asset information on the FAFSA, either for the student or the parent. If the fields show up and you aren't required to provide it down the road, the information will be excluded. A couple more things. I just want to say that if you do have to provide assets, in the past, small family-owned businesses with fewer than 100 full-time employees had been excluded. No longer the case. Family farms are no longer excluded except for the primary residence. But again, I'm hoping most people are not going to have to answer asset questions this year. Now, a little weird thing here is that they do still want to know about child support received. As I mentioned, there's no untaxed income section anymore, so they have put that in the asset section. So people who receive child support will need to provide that information in the asset section. However, only if they have to provide assets. So if you get child support, but you have a student that's receiving free and reduced lunch, then you are not going to have to answer any asset questions, including child support received. If for some reason you do have to provide that, though, let's just say you don't meet any of those, you don't have a kid in school, public school right now. If you do have to provide child support, you're going to report the information for the most recent completed calendar year. So right now that would be for 2023. So I'm going to do a quick recap, and then Mary, we will take any other questions. So to get ready to file, here's what you need to do. You need to identify who those contributors are that we talked about at the beginning. You need to create FSA IDs for all of those contributors and plan to do that 3 days before you file the FAFSA. You need to gather a list of all of the schools that the student wants to receive their FAFSA data, even if they haven't applied to those schools or been accepted yet. The student can list up to 20 schools. You're not going to be able to add schools until they get things processed, again, probably early February. So make sure that list is comprehensive now. And it is helpful to have a copy of your tax return just for reference. Okay. We do have resources available. So these are primarily for our professional partners, our school counselors and others, but certainly anyone can take a look at this information. So we have a whole page with all of our recorded presentations and slide decks, different tools that are available, and other resources. So I hope that you will check those out. We do have other resources available. And the one I want to highlight is that we will be doing FAFSA help. I put in the request today to have our FAFSA help sessions, both in person and virtual, added to our website. So early next week, you should be able to go to famemaine.com/events and see what FAFSA help sessions we have coming up. Federal student aid knew the rollout was going to be a little bumpy, I think, and so they asked us not to do any sessions until the middle of January. So our first ones start on January 17th. All right. What you think, Mary?
All right, Mila, take a breath. I might actually, a slew of questions came in right at the end. There's 4 questions. Maybe you want to just pull up the Q&A, or I can read them to you, whichever you prefer.
Yep. So it's 12:59, excuse me. So we'll answer these questions. We'll record these and we'll send them out. So if you do need to go, know that if we that you'll get these in your recording next week. So can you claim a child that lives with you year-round, but you do not claim on your taxes as living in your household? Yes, yes, you can. So there is a definition. So when you're filling out family size or you're verifying your family size on the FAFSA, read the definition. But I will just say it does not, just because you don't claim a student, that does not mean you can't list them in your family size, okay? Let's see. Okay, so to the question of free and reduced lunch, it means seniors this year, because 22 and 23, they've had free lunch. It means seniors this year. It means last year's seniors. And assuming the free and reduced lunch remains a question, it will mean next year's juniors as well. okay? So any family member for 22 or 23. I do not know the other states that are automatically providing free and reduced lunch. I am so sorry for that. I don't know that. Michael, if that's something that you really want to know the answer to, you can certainly shoot me an email and I'll see if I can get it for you. If you do report assets, the new FAFSA requires small family-owned businesses that were previously excluded. Yes, that is the case. We would have spent a lot more time talking about this if we didn't think that so many people were going to be exempt from providing assets. But oh yeah, but yes, but yes, I'm laughing because Michael has provided the answer. So yes, if people do have a small family-owned business with fewer than 100 full-time employees, they are going to be asked to provide the net worth of that business. They have not provided a lot of clarification as to how to calculate that. One of the things that I think I've heard that's helpful is like if you had to insure your business, what is the dollar value you would insure it for? And think about that in terms of the net worth. Okay, like debt against it and all of that. Hopefully
Mila,
more.
if they live on the family farm, if they actually
Yes.
reside there or
That's different. So if you live on your family farm, then you can exempt your primary residence, because keep in mind, primary residence has always been excluded from the FAFSA, continues to be exempt from the FAFSA. So if you're living on your family farm, what you want to do is you want to calculate, or figure out, which piece is your primary residence. So your home, even your garage, if you have a garage that you use to park your car in, that's exempt. That's considered your primary residence. If you have a barn where you keep your equipment, that's considered part of the business. This is definitely a bit gray. So for families who do have questions, you can certainly reach out. I'm not sure I'm going to have answers immediately, but we've had lots of questions that we've posed to federal student aid, as have others. Again, this year we have a lot of people who won't need to answer those questions. And hopefully by the time down the road, if they do need to, we'll have better clarification. So those 7 states, Colorado, California, Maine, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, New Mexico, and Vermont. So thank you. I appreciate you sharing those. All right. Anything else? Just checking on the chat, Mary. Okay, no. Okay, so I am going to stop recording and wishing all of you a great day.